Super excited to have James joining us from MongoDB. So James, I'm going to pass it over to you. You can give sort of a quick intro on yourself, and then feel free to just jump right into some of like the nitty gritty of the day-to-day, and we can start a conversation from there.
Sure. Hey guys, it's great to see all of you. My name's James. In a previous life, I worked with Tim at Twitter. And so we've known each other for a while. But it is interesting how I ended up at MongoDB. Twitter is part of that kind of that origin story, that while we were together at Twitter, we were working with a lot of like big data systems. And as I started to get deeper and deeper into like the big data ecosystem, I started learning more about just transitioning from like a analyst to like understanding data infrastructure and like real backend work. And I started messing around with different tools and stumbled on MongoDB. And I think actually, if you guys are recruiting for roles, like I'm pretty sure I found Mongo via a LinkedIn, like, hey, have you looked at this role at MongoDB kind of thing? And I must have been Googling it or something. Ended up applying for that role, and that's how I ended up here. My history at Mongo, just for some background, I started as the first person like fully focused on sales. I think our sales ops function when we were much smaller was embedded kind of in our finance team. And we decided, that we were at the point where we wanted people totally dedicated on sales. And so I kind of came into MongoDB not really knowing anything about sales ops, and just kind of like learning a lot over the last 5.5 years. In order just to get us kind of kicked off, I think it's worth noting just a little bit context about MongoDB, the company, that will kind of spark some of our conversation about PLG. So when I started at MongoDB, MongoDB was not a SaaS company. It was definitely not a PLG company. MongoDB was an enterprise software company that sold licenses, sold licenses for various periods of time to be using our enterprise software. We can also talk more about like kind of open source if you guys want, but MongoDB is a company. It's also a database. The company sells an enterprise version of the database, and that's what, 5 years ago, that was the business model. Over the next 5 years, we heavily invested in our SaaS product called MongoDB Atlas, which is a database as a service. And now Atlas is a vast majority of our revenue, especially our new revenue. And as we've transitioned from being a fully kind of enterprise software company to a SaaS company, there's been a lot of changes. Primarily like our sales compensation plans are totally different. Also, our access to data and how we do territory management, how do we build our sales motions are totally different. Now we have a ton of data about what users are doing in the product. In an enterprise-based license model, you don't really know anything. And that's a total game changer from like our sales strategy perspective. So that's kind of some background. I can talk about, I saw in the invite, I think there was a note to talk about some of the different sales roles and how they interact with the PLG function. I'm happy to start there if that's a good place, unless there's any other questions before we get started.
I think that's a great place to start, and I'll maybe kick off like a little framing around that question, James. Would love to hear kind of the evolution on the sales side as Atlas has become kind of the predominant model. How have you thought through layering in usage, and in particular, I think you mentioned it a second ago that your pricing is usage based, which is true for infrastructure. How have you taken into account that product usage and the billing component in the sales process? And like, what are some of the maybe confounding things that you learned along the way that maybe you didn't initially anticipate, but now you've like learned over the last 5 years or so? Wow, I would, if I started fresh today, I would do things completely differently. If there's like one or two or three things that kind of match that, would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many. I'm trying to think. My head is the gears in my head are spinning because I think there's like so much I could talk about. I'm trying to think of like what the most important things are, but we have a system at MongoDB. We have like sales is a science, not an art at MongoDB. It is a science. Like if people don't fit into the process of our sales, the way things work at Mongo, that like those types of reps don't tend to do well. And so we had a really, really well-defined, well-documented, well-audited process of deal qualification. We use the MEDDIC process, and we get to a point where we're very strict about qualifying deals in a very specific way. And the transition to like a usage-based model, basically, I want to make sure I'm not overcomplicating this, but basically makes like that sales cycle like shorter, if that makes sense. Like, and when you're trying to sell a commitment and getting people to say like, hey, I'm going to commit to spending $20,000, $100,000 for this year up front, like you have to get to the point where you're talking to the economic buyer, you're identifying that they have the budget for that amount, that they're willing to earmark it to this product for this amount of time. And those are difficult conversations to have where you hit all this complexity with like security and legal and all these things. And it really draws a sales cycle out, versus in a consumption-based world where we get to the point we say like, do you want to put down your credit card and start super small and just testing this out? I mean, that takes like, and the data supports us, it takes like a third of the time. And particularly from a sales perspective, you're not needing to interact with all those levels of complexities of the procurements and the legals necessarily at that point to do that kind of testing and start to get people into the product and start to use it. And so your objectives start to change with your sales cycle to, it starts from a point of how do we get to economic buyer? How do we qualify that they have budget for this, that they have the pain, that they want to actually solve this too? How do we just get people onto the product, trying it, and let the product sell itself at that point? That's a much less complex sales motion, which is awesome. That's what we want to incentivize. And then Tim, to your question, like what are those nuggets of like things that we learned along the way? I think it took us too long to realize that you need to think about our sales comp plans from the point of view of like what's best for the customer. Like if a customer says that they want to do a commitment, that's fine, let them, but like don't force them to do it. And I think we overvalued wanting people to commit to deals for too long. And so we're kind of at the point now where like, if you're a sales rep, there's not really any benefit to getting commit, just get people starting to use the product. And that's what we want to optimize for. Most people doing starting to use the product, and within existing customers, we've kind of another kind of nugget is we didn't have a way to document new use cases or like kind of what we call like new workloads. So if somebody's starting to use the product to do a different thing, that's something that we want a salesperson to kind of facilitate, but we didn't have any way of like tracking that, auditing it. That's basically the number one thing that we want sales reps doing. They can't control in a usage-based world what a customer is going to necessarily spend, but they can control what the customer is going to use our tool for. And that ultimately is a proxy for how much they're going to spend. So, yeah.
That's really, really helpful. Oh, go ahead, Breezy.
Yeah, I see a couple questions coming in, and I see Vishal,
Yeah.
I think you got most of it answered, but was there more you wanted to add in there, Vishal, and maybe ask it?
Yeah, no, great answer. And I'm curious, under what circumstances, James, is the identification of an economic buyer and access to budget important for your sale? Under what circumstances does MongoDB consider that identification valuable for a rep to engage in?
So the getting to the EB and kind of like, qualifying pain and budget, all of that, that's still important from like a forecasting perspective. And when you're working with big strategic accounts, that's still going to be really important. But really, like there is definitely a shift where like in an old world, like deals weren't happening until you got to that person. If a sales rep wasn't talking to EB, it was like, there's no deal here, and don't even try to call, like do not call, put that in your call. We would not forecast that. But at this point, we're focused more on not necessarily like getting that person, but getting the product in the hands of the people who get value from it. And then they experience value, groundswell builds up. The sales rep should still try to be getting to the business stakeholders. But the product at that point is playing more of a role in the value demonstration. And so it's just not as critical. Like it was a non-starter in an upfront commitment kind of selling licenses world. In a SaaS world, it's still important, but that's not like the number one thing that we want to achieve. We want to get the product in people's hands. That's like our goal now. That's what our sales comp plans emphasize. That's what our sales motion emphasizes. And all of our tools and audit and forecasting are all focused on making sure the product is getting in the customer's hands.
Got
Thank
it.
you.
And I think related to that too, Devin, your question here, you can, I mean, I'll have you ask it just for the sake of participation, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of at the point where we're building our like sales teams, compensation, et cetera, everything you just mentioned, to encourage them to get the product into people's hands. But what we're struggling with now is where does that handoff happen between sales and success? And what does that look like in MongoDB?
Great question. Great question. And that reminded me, I was gonna, so to start at a high level, when I think about, I also just in general, I kind of think of myself as like a product manager of sales. And that's like a weird kind of application of that role, but like starting to think about who are the users that we're serving, what are the personas we're working with, like what are the use cases? And we have a lot of areas of transformation. Like I think going to a SaaS tool is an inflection point in the business where you kind of want to like take things back to first principles and then build them back up. And so one of the like first principles we establish is across our go-to-market, we want to acquire customers, expand customers, and retain customers. And so our roles should be focused on those three things. And I think in any company, sales is the different roles across go-to-market, they can be exclusive to one of those, like just acquisition, or they can, you know, straddle a couple of those different functions. So the question about customer success, the relationship between customer success and sales is really important, because I think that traditionally customer success has been like an overlay role. Like they're focused on making sure people are using the product in a way that benefits them. And they're compensated based on renewal rates, but reps were also compensated on renewals, and there was not necessarily conflict in those things, but the way that we had kind of set it up, there was a little bit of natural conflict between those roles, particularly in their comp plans, because customer success, here's just an example, is customer success could interact with the customer and say, hey, you're running super hot, you're using these, you're running a really expensive backups that you probably don't need. You can like disable that and you'll be billed less. And they're like, great, thank you so much. I'm now using the product better. I'm very happy. And then the sales rep is like, why is my consumption going down? I get paid on consumption. And so there can be like a healthy disagreement sometimes between those roles. So right now, we're in the process of refocusing where the emphasis is for sales with regards to like renewal customers.
Sorry, could you say that again?
My
Sorry.
Siri just acted up. But so right now, customer success is still aligned to not necessarily expansion or renewals, but they're more aligned to like, well, I guess I would say retention is their biggest objective. They get compensated based on renewal rates and customer success qualified leads. So we call them CSQLs. I think there's still, honestly, I think there's areas for us to improve to align them, like to be more with the grain with sales. But I think that's super important.
Cool. I see a couple questions coming in. Or Devin, do you have anything as a follow-up?
No, I was just going to say that's super helpful. Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see a couple other questions in there. Feel free to come off mute and ask those. I see Jake and
I can ask mine. I guess kind of piggybacking off what you answered with Devin. How do you think about programmatic activation? So, for example, we get a pretty long tail of self-serve customers that just don't really have a need to, like, for us, it's a lot more cut and dry around who needs to talk to sales. Basically, do you need enterprise on-prem deployment or not?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of customers don't need that at the beginning, but some as they grow, especially like some of our smaller fintech customers are like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna build an admin panel. But if they start wanting to actually use their or access their, more private or private financial data, they may need to do that. So how do you guys think about programmatically nurturing people and then kind of serving them up to sales or success when you're ready?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's something we're thinking about a lot right now. And for context of MongoDB, we have a self-serve like full segment. So people can go to a web, we have marketing drive people to sign up and swipe their credit card and start to consume a MongoDB Atlas. And they don't have to talk to salespeople at all. And there's a big kind of question of how do we want, like we could just send all those people to sales, to your point, but do we want that? And like if sales convert somebody to a contract from spending on a credit card, is that valuable? And so there's a big kind of like work stream going on right now to figure out how we want to use those, because there's a really valuable like customer cohort. I think your question is like more about how do you kind of like nurture and grow those customers without necessarily leveraging human capital resources on them? Yeah, so that's where I think like the PLG motion is, or maybe not the PLG motion, but like the ability to understand how people are using the product is really powerful. And the analogy that I've used with other people at MongoDB is like, and for different products, it's going to be different, but for like a database product, there's not necessarily like a right or wrong way to use database, but there are good and bad ways to use it. And I kind of think of it as like, what we want to achieve is like a GPS. Like, I'm in New York City right now. I put my GPS LA, and like, if I start driving, it's going to tell me when I'm going the wrong direction. It's going to tell me when I can be rerouting, and it might tell me I actually need to like get out of a car and take a plane. Like, and I think like establishing, so what we've done is we've established the most common like areas of concern, or it's mostly kind of like the wrong directions. Like when are people going in the wrong direction or doing something, or there's something simple they could change to be having a better experience. Figuring out what those things are and like building playbooks for each of them. Some of those things, or many of those things, don't involve a human. So it could just be like an alert that says you have provisioned X amount of memory and you're not using it. That's a very specific database use case, obviously. But for us, it was like, it's honestly not something that's like, I would even say is like super data sciencey. It's like talking to our CSMs, understanding like, hey, what are the main things that you see people doing? Like, what are the top 5? Okay, cool. Let's build an alert in the product that allows them just to know, hey, like a lot of customers try this, doesn't work. Have you considered adding an index this query? Have you considered doing X, Y, and Z? And then it will allow them to then, if they want to self opt into, talk to a rep or look into buying, professional services, like they can do that. But that, it's not necessarily forcing a human on them to try to sell them something. It's specific and intentional to address what's happening and the way that they're using the product, and kind of trying to provide a solution, and then prompting them if they want to talk to somebody, then they could.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
For sure.
Awesome. So one thing I was thinking about while you're talking is you talked a lot about segmenting out the different people who are using the product. What different ways have you thought about segmenting folks, and what's sort of like been your approach to doing that?
Yeah, you mean segmentation in terms of like profiling existing customers, like people in the product who we like have data on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a good question. So there's kind of like two, the way we think about it is kind of like two pillars. One is like profiling somebody based on their product usage. People who we have what we call like an org engagement score that our data science team built, but basically it just lets you know how engaged is somebody with the product. Like if you're Slack, the company, like, you could see people who are sending a lot of Slacks, adding a lot of new users, creating a lot of new channels. Like it's a proxy to measure just like how kind of active people are. So kind of one spectrum is how much are people using the product? How complicated are they? How sophisticated are they? And like, what's their velocity, or sorry, what's their acceleration? Is their acceleration non-zero, or is it 0? And then another kind of pillar is like, what's the opportunity of that account? Because somebody could be going crazy, could be going ham with database, doing all this crazy stuff, testing, but like, we know that they're like a super small account that like, until they get funding and can like actually like have a commercial app, that like they're not going to consume meaningful amounts of dollars. And so it's an intersection of understanding like, hey, I could see this customer growing and they actually have potential to spend a lot of money. And that's how we think about layering sales resources. It's all like an interesting kind of just resource allocation problem. The customers with the highest upside, we want to put people on. That's obviously an expensive resource. The people who we think are good targets but are not as high as ROI, we want to leverage marketing resources or maybe like SDR resources.
Got it. Cool. Other questions do folks have?
If no one else chimes in, I've got one.
Yeah, go for it, Tim.
A common thread is compensation and like usage-based pricing and how kind of that plays into it. You know, I would say if I had to guess, Mongo is probably one of the more complex, you know, situations as far as sales comp goes and commission with respect to usage-based pricing. So yeah, I don't know if you want to do your best to like distill down thinking around that, but yeah, for folks aren't going to be as advanced as you guys necessarily, but maybe somewhere on that journey and on that path as you're thinking of sales comp. So yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, for sure. I think more about sales comp than I probably should. Like the nuggets are like, make it simple as possible, and align it to what creates value for the customer. And that's what we kind of that's what we needed to improve on like 2 years ago, is we had a consumption product, but we were still forcing customers to do commits. And they're like, why are we doing commits for a product that ultimately like registers like a monthly usage? We now moved to a fully consumption model. And that works because as somebody is using the product, that's when they're getting value out of it. And so aligning how sales is getting paid and to what they're driving to the value that a customer gets out of the product is huge. I think that like in any sales comp plan, you can risk just getting overcomplicated by like looking at all the nuances of, you know, there's obviously, when I talked about like retention, expansion, acquisition, like those are the 3 things that you typically might be driving. So we have like acquisition functions, we have growth functions, but roughly our comp plans are focused on driving new logos, new customers, and just growing the ARR in accounts. And I think just trying to simplify it to those things as much as you can makes it just simple for the reps to understand what their priorities are, what you want them to do, and to focus them on what is going to create value for customers.
A common theme that ends up coming up on these calls is around the role of like the SDR and BDR teams. And I know you mentioned like some subset of users maybe being handled by that team, but could you talk a little bit about that role and how you've set it up?
Yeah. So I think in the conversation of like, so in a SaaS world, you know, you have a ton of this data that's coming from the product, and that creates like a data science kind of problem to kind of understand and wrap your head around all the data. And I think just like one of my comments is like, you don't necessarily have to be super complex about understanding all of the signal, but one thing that we have learned is when we start to analyze and think about like what people are doing in the product, we can't necessarily know what it means, but it prompts questions. So for example, if we see somebody that's doing like, I don't know, XYZ, that doesn't mean that they're having a problem. It might look like they're having a problem, but we can't know that for sure. But what it's a great use case for is an SDR can reach out and from like an educated perspective say, I see you're doing X, Y, and Z, which potentially looks problematic, but I don't know that you have a problem. Is there something I can help you with? Like, are you having actual problems with, you know, reliability, consistency, availability? And then that we've actually seen really productive conversations with customers that are like, oh, actually, no, I was just testing this out, but it actually did keep failing. I'm not really having a problem, but I did have a question about how this could work. Like, and then they'll be able to sell them, you know, a consulting credit or something like that. So I think the key is like, just because you think a customer might be doing something, having that SDR, so like a low cost human resource, engage with them can be really valuable because it sparks a conversation, and that conversation can turn to something really meaningful. And it's a much more valuable conversation than SDR reaching out and saying, hey, I found you're this role on LinkedIn. I think you'd really benefit from this. Can you please talk with me? When do you have 30 minutes? Like, I get those all day, every day. I never respond to them. But when an SDR reaches out to me and they say, it looks like you're doing something interesting. Maybe it's an issue, maybe it's not, I don't know. Would you like to talk about it? Our ability to engage with customers in productive ways is so much better, like through that means.
Go ahead, Jeremy. I know you had a question over there.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this. So I'm curious to know when you do, when sales does get involved, when you've kind of seen signal from your customer that they warrant sales engagement, are you then trying to lead them back down a kind of product-led self-serve type engagement to minimize human capital? Or are you, at that point, are you kind of full Monty kind of traditional sales engagement?
Good question.
And what's your thinking around that?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as a salesperson gets involved, it's like their claws are on them. And that's the thing. It's like, we want to make sure that when we're going to pull in a salesperson, that it is a meaningful engagement, which means A, that we can actually that they can provide value to them. And then B, that there's meaningful upside in them spending time there. Because sales is always they're always looking for new customers. They're always looking for accounts that are going to be growing in ARR. That's how their comp plans work. And so the moment you kind of put them on there, they're blinders on, they're fully focused on that motion of getting them onto a contract, helping them to find new use cases and drive consumption. And so they never really end up getting pushed back towards the self-serve motion.
In the context for that, we are pre-product launch, so we're in a slightly luxurious position of being able to create this all from the ground up. I'm not sure, because I think the temptation is once you, as you say, once you've kind of released the hunt dogs, they're going to hunt that deal down. But I kind of I don't want to create the wrong mindset or habits in some ways, and so I want the whole team to be moving more towards product-led than sales-led.
I think, I think just kind of reading into that a little bit, what you want, the CSM motion, the way that you design the sales role and the way that you compensate them is going to drive the behavior that you want. So if you want to continue to push someone back towards a self-service function, compensate them based on product activations and not actually spend. You want them to hit certain milestones in the product, help them, encourage them to get to those milestones, but then have them focused on bouncing to somebody else to get those milestones. You don't want to. They're kind of encouraged at MongoDB to stay with a customer to continue to drive usage in there, but we could change the comp plan to make them focus more on, okay, once you get to this milestone, there's not much else you can do. You got to focus on somebody else. You got to jump to the next account. So the comp plan can fix that if you don't want them just to swarm those people.
Really kind of useful thinking. What also in tune with that is to what that handoff from sales to CS looks like. Part of me wants sales to stay on that for a long time, to not only drive that kind of, to sell in the right way to begin with, kind of land and expand, and then stay with it so you're not exposing the friction of that kind of handover to CS. For sales to kind of live with that deal until it's expanded to some degree, and then hand over to sales, CS at some point later in the future.
Yeah, and actually in our world, there are no accounts that don't have, if account has a CS, a customer success rep on them, they also have a sales rep. Okay, so they always have both.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I know we're 2 or 3 minutes over, so I appreciate everyone sticking on. And James, thanks so much for sharing everything.
For sure.
We have the Slack Connect as well. If anyone has questions, you can always ask them in there, or I'll also send a follow-up email. So if you have sort of continued questions, we can keep the conversation going. But James, thank you. Really appreciate it. I know everybody else does.
Nice talking to you guys. Cheers.
Okay,
James.
bye. See you, everyone.
Thanks, James.